when silence costs more than money. It didn't start with a scandal or a collapse. It started with a pause, a decision not to speak, not to act, not to intervene. A moment so quiet the world barely noticed it. Yet this single silence would grow into a force powerful enough to shake a billionaire's empire and alter its legacy forever. People think danger comes from bold mistakes, loud failures, public missteps. But sometimes the most devastating blows come from what isn't said, from hesitation, from avoidance, from choosing comfort when truth demands disruption. And today, in an age where every leader stands under a spotlight, the cost of silence has never been higher. To understand this unraveling, we step into the life of a billionaire known for strategic brilliance, for seeing patterns others missed, for staying 3 moves ahead. Their empire was strong, their reputation immaculate, their influence unmatched. But the first reveal lay behind a simple oversight, a small internal issue reported quietly through unofficial channels. It seemed trivial. It seemed harmless. It seemed like something that could be handled later. So the billionaire chose silence. At first, nothing happened. Profits rose. Markets expanded. Teams celebrated quarterly victories. Yet beneath the success, the unnoticed issue began to grow. Slow, subtle, corrosive. Employees whispered about it in hallways. Mid-level managers argued over responsibilities. A few tried to raise concerns, but the system swallowed their warnings like echoes lost in a vast chamber. Still, the billionaire stayed silent. The reveals sharpened when early signs of trouble appeared in scattered reports. Slight inefficiencies, unexpected delays, a dip in performance metrics. Nothing alarming on its own, but together they formed a pattern that pointed back to the unresolved issue buried months earlier. The billionaire skimmed the reports, understood the implications, and yet again said nothing, perhaps out of pride, perhaps out of fear, perhaps because addressing the issue meant admitting it had been ignored for too long. But silence, once chosen, gains momentum. More cracks formed in the system. More whispers spread. Managers clashed over decisions made without clear direction. The billionaire watched quietly from a distance, convinced the problem would resolve itself. It wouldn't. And as silence deepened, the conflict waiting in the shadows began to wake. The silence that once seemed harmless now began to echo through every corner of the empire. The unresolved issue, once a tiny spark, evolved into a spreading fire. At first it burned through efficiency, slowing workflows and disrupting schedules. But soon it reached relationships, trust, and the delicate balance that held the organization together. The reveal intensified when department heads quietly escalated their concerns. They submitted formal reports, flagged irregular behaviors, and pleaded for guidance. Yet the billionaire, overwhelmed by larger strategic battles, hesitated once again. Silence felt easier than confrontation, familiar, safer, but each moment of inaction fed the growing instability. Tension hardened when internal metrics revealed sharp declines in a key division. The numbers didn't collapse outright. They sagged, dipped, faltered, enough to worry analysts, enough to attract whispers from competitors, enough to send early warning signals through the stock market. Investors requested meetings the billionaire delayed. The more the silence stretched, the more dangerous it became. Inside the empire, lines began to fracture. Managers blamed each other. Employees grew frustrated by directionless leadership. A quiet power struggle emerged, fueled by uncertainty and the absence of decisive action. Some leaders tried to take control. Others withdrew, protecting their teams from the fallout they sensed approaching. The organization moved without coordination, like a machine with gears grinding out of sync. The emotional weight on the billionaire deepened. Each morning brought new reports outlining problems that could have been contained months earlier. Problems now intertwined, amplified, and accelerated by neglect. The billionaire felt the pressure building behind closed doors, a slow tightening around the heart. The knowledge that one earlier decision could have prevented the chaos now multiplying before their eyes. Then came the first public crack. A leaked memo revealed the internal dysfunction. Anonymous employees described a culture fraying from within, a leadership unwilling to confront a growing crisis. Media outlets seized the narrative instantly. Headlines questioned the billionaire's judgment. Commentators debated whether the empire, was losing its edge. Markets responded with sharp, uneasy movements. This external spotlight intensified the internal conflict. Executives, no longer willing to wait for direction, proposed contradictory strategies: aggressive restructuring, mass hiring, emergency audits. No two plans aligned. Meetings became battlegrounds of clashing personalities and divergent priorities. The billionaire watched the empire twist under its own weight, realizing the silence that protected them once now served as an open invitation for disorder. And then came the blow the billionaire feared most. A major partner announced a suspension of collaboration until the empire demonstrated stability. The room fell silent when the news broke. This wasn't a setback. It was a warning shot, a signal that the world had begun to lose faith. The billionaire finally understood that silence had grown from a small personal choice into a force capable of destabilizing everything they had built, and the conflict, long avoided, was now impossible to escape. The conflict exploded the moment the suspended partnership triggered a chain reaction across the empire. Suppliers tightened terms. Investors demanded emergency briefings. Analysts published reports predicting long-term instability. What began as a whisper months ago had evolved into a full-scale crisis, and the billionaire could no longer shield themselves behind silence. The consequences had arrived, sharp, public, and unavoidable. Inside the company, chaos deepened. Departments that once cooperated now operated like rival factions, each trying to protect their territory. Leaders clung to influence, offering competing strategies that contradicted one another. Meetings escalated into shouting matches. Employees felt the tension in every hallway, every email, every directive that seemed to shift by the hour. The empire wasn't simply strained, it was fracturing. The billionaire felt the emotional weight multiplying with every moment. Their silence had become a mirror reflecting every fear they once avoided. Fear of confrontation, fear of losing control, fear of admitting a mistake. But now, the consequences were no longer theoretical. They were tangible, measurable, devastating. And the billionaire understood with painful clarity that the crisis was no longer the issue itself. It was the culture that had grown around the silence. Then came the internal investigation. A group of senior executives, alarmed by the instability, launched a formal inquiry into the original problem. Their findings were brutal. The small issue that had once appeared trivial had expanded into structural weakness across several divisions. Budgets were misaligned, processes outdated, leadership disconnected. What could have been fixed in days now required months of reconstruction. The findings triggered panic among stakeholders. Some executives threatened resignation. Others proposed radical downsizing. A few quietly contacted competitors, exploring exit opportunities in case the empire collapsed. Trust in leadership evaporated, replaced by a palpable desperation to survive whatever came next. For the billionaire, the emotional breaking point arrived late one night, while reviewing the investigation's final section, a timeline that traced the crisis all the way back to the moment of silence. It showed, step by step, how every warning had been ignored, how every delay had compounded the damage, how the empire's growing instability mapped perfectly onto the billionaire's refusal to act. The realization struck like a blow. The greatest threat to the empire had not been external pressure or market shifts. It had been silence, their silence. But in the depths of that realization, something shifted. For the first time, the billionaire accepted the full truth. Fixing the crisis meant confronting it directly, publicly, unequivocally. The era of silence was over, and the path ahead demanded a voice strong enough to rebuild what had been broken. The decision waiting on the other side of that truth would change not just the empire, but the billionaire themselves. The climax came when the billionaire finally broke the silence that had nearly destroyed the empire. Standing before employees, investors, partners, and a world eager for answers, they spoke with clarity forged through failure, fear, and weeks of internal collapse. No scripts, no advisors, just truth. They admitted the mistake. They acknowledged the silence. They accepted responsibility for everything the empire had endured. The room held its breath. Some expected excuses. Others braced for denial. But instead, the billionaire delivered something no one predicted. A plan not to salvage the old structure, but to rebuild a stronger one, a complete cultural reset, a restructuring of communication channels, transparent reporting systems, leadership accountability protocols, direct access for workers at every level to voice concerns without fear. The empire reacted with shock and then relief, because in that moment, truth did what silence never could. It united the fractured company. Departments that once war with each other found common purpose. Executives who had lost faith rediscovered direction. Employees who felt ignored finally felt seen. The crisis didn't vanish instantly, but its grip loosened. For the first time in months, the empire exhaled. The world responded just as intensely. Media outlets praised the unprecedented transparency. Analysts revised predictions. Even the suspended partner reconsidered his position, impressed by the billionaire's willingness to confront failure head-on. What once looked like the downfall of a titan now resembled the rebirth of one. But the most profound shift occurred within the billionaire themselves. In the days that followed, they walked through the company not as a distant figurehead, but as a present, engaged leader. They listened to concerns. They visited struggling teams. They acknowledged wounds left unhealed. And in doing so, they discovered something powerful. The empire had not been weakened by the crisis. It had been strengthened by honesty. The final resolution settled quietly over the empire. Systems improved, trust returned, partnerships revived, and slowly, the billionaire's legacy transformed, no longer defined by silence, but by the courage to break it. Their empire, once teetering on collapse, now stood on stronger foundations than ever before, because silence had cost them everything, but truth gave it back. Subscribe to join the journey.